He reached for my hand right before we walked in and whispered, "Just let me handle the conversation tonight, okay?" These people operate at a completely different level. The less you say about the food stuff, the better. I nodded, let go of his hand. And then Douglas Kenner, who controlled over 2,000 hotel rooms across 14 states and had texted me at 11 o'clock the night before about a cardamom brioche recipe, looked up from across the lobby and walked directly past my husband without a single glance. "Blythe." He said my name like he'd been waiting all evening to use it. Both hands extended, the kind of greeting reserved for people you genuinely want to see. "I told the whole team you'd be here tonight. Half the room has been looking for you." My husband's outstretched hand hung in the air for a long moment before he slowly lowered it back to his side. "I'm 31 years old. I run a food consulting firm out of a converted kitchen space in Portland that smells permanently like brown butter and cardamom. And, when we're testing savory programs, a very particular combination of truffle oil and disappointment when a recipe doesn't land right. I drive a 2019 Subaru Forester, with tasting spoons rattling around in the cup holder, and a back seat perpetually occupied by coolers and notebook binders, and at least 3 half-eaten granola bars from brands I've been asked to reformulate. I am not what most people picture when they think of someone who runs a successful business. I don't wear blazers to client meetings. I wear chef whites or a clean Henley, depending on whether I'm in the test kitchen or across a conference table. My hair is almost always pulled back because loose hair near an open flame is genuinely dangerous, and I've trained myself to just keep it that way. My hands are rough from years of kneading and folding and working with heat. I get excited about things like the fat content ratio in a croissant lamination, or the way different salt percentages change the perceived sweetness in a dark chocolate ganache. My full title, the one on my business cards and my website, and the 2-page spread Food and Wine ran on my work 18 months ago, is Culinary Development Consultant and Recipe Systems Architect, which sounds made up. But what it means in practice is that I build the food programs that go inside hotels, restaurant groups, corporate campuses, and airline catering operations. I figure out not just what tastes good but what scales, what travels, what can be executed consistently by a kitchen team in Denver and a kitchen team in Savannah, using the same equipment and the same proteins, sourced through the same distribution chain. It's a niche field. Most people don't know it exists. My husband of 3 years was one of those people. His name is Callum. He's a commercial real estate broker who specializes in hospitality properties, hotel developments, resort acquisitions, the kind of deals that involve lengthy pitch decks and expensive dinners and handshakes with people who own things. He's very good at his job. He's also very good at presenting himself, which is a different skill set entirely, and one I used to admire before I started noticing how often it required making everything around him look smaller by comparison. We met at a friend's birthday party in Seattle. He was funny and warm and asked follow-up questions, which is rarer than it should be. When I told him I developed food programs, he said, "What does that actually mean?" And I talked for 20 minutes about a hotel breakfast project I was finishing, and he listened like it was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. That's who I thought I was marrying. The shift was gradual enough that I kept explaining it away. He'd introduce me at his work events as my wife, she does food consulting, with a tone that landed somewhere between fond and apologetic, like he was bracing for people to be bored. He'd check his phone when I talked about a project challenge. When I landed the Kenner hospitality contract, the biggest of my career, a $2.4 million annual deal to overhaul the food program across 47 hotels nationwide, I told him at dinner and he said, "That's great, babe," and then asked if I'd seen where he left his laptop charger. He never asked the client's name. I told myself he was busy. I told myself he didn't need to understand the details to be supportive. I told myself a lot of things that were easier than the truth, which was that my husband had decided early on what category I belonged in and didn't see any reason to revisit that assessment. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. He came home holding a cream-colored envelope with the Kenner Hospitality logo embossed in the corner, and the look of a man who'd just won something significant. "Douglas Kenner is hosting a private dinner at the Portland Grand," he said. "Black tie, 12 couples. I've been trying to get in front of this man for 2 years." The Portland Grand was a Kenner property. one I knew well. I'd spent the previous 6 months working directly with their executive kitchen team on a complete menu overhaul. Breakfast, brunch, room service, and the new tasting menu for the hotel's signature restaurant. Douglas and I had weekly calls. He had my cell number saved under my first name. Just that morning, he'd sent a voice memo, asking whether the new savory waffle station would work logistically for the Vegas property rollout. My husband kept talking. If I can get 5 minutes with him about the East Side development pitch, this could change everything. He looked at me then with that particular expression I'd come to recognize over 3 years. Hopeful but slightly uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure I was up to what he was about to propose. I was thinking you could come as my date. Not I'd love for you to be there, could come. Like I was an option he was carefully extending. Of course, I said. When is it? 3 weeks. Which was, apparently, exactly enough time to put together a comprehensive coaching program for how I should behave. It started with small comments woven into regular conversation. A mention that I should schedule a hair appointment with an actual stylist rather than just pulling it back the way I usually did. A suggestion to look for dresses with recognizable labels because people in Douglas Kenner's circle noticed those details. By the end of the first week, it had escalated from suggestions into something that felt more like instruction. You should avoid going deep on the food science stuff, he told me one evening. These are finance and development people. They're not going to find the technical details interesting. What should I talk about instead? Just be warm. Ask people about their work. Listen more than you talk. He said it gently. The way you'd say something to someone you were genuinely trying to protect. These are seriously successful people. I'm not saying you can't hold your own. I just want the night to go well for us. The dress conversation happened during week 2. He'd found a boutique downtown that carried what he described as elevated basics and went with me to help choose. I bought a navy dress that was genuinely beautiful and cost more than I'd normally spend on clothing I wasn't going to spill something on. He nodded when I showed it to him and said perfect, like I'd completed an assignment I hadn't known I was given. The night before the dinner, he sat me down on the couch after we'd eaten and said he wanted to walk through the evening. Douglas Kenner is the priority, but I'll handle the introduction. Just follow my lead, okay? Don't volunteer too much about work. If someone asks, say you consult for hospitality brands and change the subject. He leaned forward and put his hands together the way he did when something mattered to him. These people are at a different level than us right now. I'm trying to get us there. But I need tonight to go smoothly. I listened to all of it. I didn't push back. Part of me wanted to see how far he'd take it. How completely he'd reveal what he actually thought of me when the stakes felt high enough. And part of me was just tired. Tired of explaining myself to someone who'd never once asked a genuine question about my work in 3 years of marriage. I had spent 6 months inside the Portland Grand. I knew which elevator ran slow. I knew the sous chef's name and that she made the best staff meal on Thursdays with leftover braised short rib. I knew which banquet room had the heating issue that made the pastry display cases sweat and how we'd solved it. I knew that Douglas Kenner's favorite thing I'd developed for the property was a honey miso butter served with the house bread, and that 3 weeks prior he'd texted me a photo of an empty ramekin with the caption, "Every single table asks for more of this." My husband knew none of it, because he'd never asked. The night of the dinner was clear and cold. He wore his best suit and had gotten a haircut that afternoon and spent a long time in the bathroom, achieving something he wanted to look effortless. He was quiet in the car, the specific quiet of someone running through lines in their head, rehearsing the version of himself he planned to present. He reached for my hand right before we walked in. Just let me handle the conversation tonight. These people operate at a completely different level. The less you say about the food stuff, the better. I nodded, let go of his hand. The lobby of the Portland Grand hit me the way it always did. The smell first, because smell is always first for me. A warm combination of the cedar diffusers we'd selected during the renovation and the faint sweetness from the pastry station that carried even out here. Then the light, the amber tone we'd specified to make the space feel like late afternoon regardless of the hour. Everything in this lobby had been shaped by a decision I made. My husband was already scanning the room, running his mental checklist of who to approach and in what order. Douglas Kenner was near the bar talking with two other men when he looked up and saw me. He moved toward me immediately. Not toward us, toward me. The way you move toward someone you've genuinely been looking forward to seeing. Blithe. Both hands extended, warm and familiar. I told the whole team you'd be here. Half the room has been asking about you. He turned briefly and raised his voice just enough to carry across the lobby. Guys, she's here. My husband's outstretched hand went unacknowledged for a long moment. He stood frozen mid-greeting, the rehearsed opening line, dead on his lips, everything about him short-circuited. Douglas turned to him with polite interest. You must be Callum, Blythe's mentioned you. My husband nodded, made a sound that might have been words. I've been working with your wife for 6 months, Douglas said. She completely rebuilt how we think about food across our entire portfolio. 3 firms before her told me what I was asking for wasn't scalable. She made it not only scalable, but better than anything we'd originally imagined. Guest satisfaction scores in our dining programs are up 31% across the properties where we've already rolled out. She's an architect, my husband said, and then seemed to realize that wasn't right. Culinary development consultant, I said. There's a difference. Douglas smiled, and there was something warm in it that had nothing to do with performance. She's being modest. What she does requires food science, supply chain logistics, kitchen workflow design, and the patience to walk a very skeptical executive chef in Las Vegas through a complete paradigm shift. He glanced at my husband with an expression I couldn't quite read, something measured and calm. You must be incredibly proud. My husband opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Douglas linked his arm through mine the way he always did when he had something he wanted to discuss. I need to steal her for a bit. There are several people here who've specifically asked to meet her tonight. You don't mind? It wasn't really a question. I didn't look back at my husband standing alone in the lobby I'd helped design. The next 2 hours were remarkable in the most ordinary way, remarkable because they were so completely unremarkable to me. I talked about what I always talk about in rooms full of hospitality people. Sustainable sourcing, menu engineering, the economics of a breakfast program when you're running 47 properties and egg prices shift. I talked about the Vegas kitchen manager who'd resisted every reformulation and came around after we ran a blind tasting, and his own staff voted unanimously for the new build. I talked about regional supplier relationships and the specific challenge of making room service food that arrives looking intentional rather than defeated. This was my world, had been for 8 years. I spotted my husband several times throughout the evening, trying to insert himself into clusters of conversation. He'd introduce himself, try to steer toward the real estate pitch he'd been refining for weeks. People were polite in the way people are when they're waiting for someone to finish so they can turn back to what they were actually discussing. Without a real entry point, without Douglas's endorsement, he was simply a commercial real estate broker at a hospitality event. There were a dozen of those. Near the end of the evening, Douglas pulled me into one of the smaller meeting rooms off the main corridor and placed a folder on the table between us. I want to extend the contract to include the coastal properties, he said. 8 locations, phased rollout over 20 months. And I want you to have creative lead on the flagship restaurant concept for the Charleston property. Full kitchen collaboration, naming credit on the menu. I looked at the proposed terms. I know it's more than you've taken on at once, he said. But I've watched how you work. You don't miss things. That's rarer than people understand. I told him I'd review it with my attorney and respond by end of the week. He said that was exactly right. When I came back out to the main room, my husband was standing at the edge of the bar with a drink he'd been working on for a while. He watched me cross the room. He watched Douglas follow me in and rest a brief hand on my shoulder before heading back toward the larger group. The expression on my husband's face was not anger yet. It was something that comes before anger, the look of a person watching a story they believed about themselves collapse in real time. The drive home was quiet in a way that pressed against the windows of the car. He gripped the steering wheel. He breathed carefully. He stared at the road. You could have told me, he said finally, turning onto our street. I told you I was working on the Portland Grand, I said. About a year ago at dinner. You said that's great and asked if I'd seen your laptop charger. You didn't say it was a Douglas Kenner project. I said Kenner Hospitality, same thing. That is not the same thing. His voice was controlled but shaking underneath. You let me walk in there and try to introduce you to a man who's been texting you about recipes. That's humiliating. You humiliated yourself, I said, and I kept my voice even because I wasn't saying it to wound him. I was just saying it because it was true. You spent 3 weeks preparing me to be your accessory. You told me not to talk about my work because it would bore people. You told me these people were at a different level than us. I looked at him. You meant a different level than me. I was trying to help you. You were embarrassed by me. You've been embarrassed by me since the beginning. You just didn't know how much it showed until tonight. He went silent in a way that meant he couldn't find the refutation because there wasn't one. I went inside and called my best friend Opal while I packed a bag. She answered on the second ring, said of course, said she'd already put sheets on the guest bed, said take your time. I was out the door in 20 minutes. He texted me every day for the next week. Denial first, then anger, then something that read like an apology but was really just an explanation of why his feelings made sense, which is a different thing entirely. What he wanted was for me to agree that his surprise had been understandable, which would make him reasonable, and the dinner a misunderstanding we could move past. He wasn't asking whether he'd been wrong, he was asking me to agree that the night we'd both discovered, it didn't count against him. I let the messages sit. My attorney didn't sound surprised when I called. She sounded tired in the knowing way people sound when they recognize a pattern they've seen before. Then, 2 weeks later, his attorney filed a motion claiming he was entitled to a portion of my company's value, but because his emotional support and partnership had enabled my professional growth. I sat with that for a long time before I could find it absurd rather than just painful. The case fell apart quickly. My firm was incorporated 4 years before I met him. Every major contract, every award nomination, every industry feature had come from relationships I'd built and work I'd done. His contribution to my career had been primarily the suggestion that I not discuss it at parties. The divorce was finalized 7 months after the Portland Grand Dinner. My career did what careers do when you stop spending energy managing someone else's comfort with your success. The Kenner extension went through. The Charleston restaurant opened to reviews that mentioned me by name in publications I hadn't been directly interviewed for, which felt different in a way I hadn't anticipated. Food and Wine ran a follow-up profile. I was named a James Beard semi-finalist, which made my mother cry on the phone and made me sit alone in my test kitchen for a few quiet minutes just letting it be real. I hired 2 junior consultants and a full-time operations manager. I moved the business into a larger space in a building that used to be a commercial bakery, with the original deck, ovens still standing in one corner. Decorative now, but beautiful in the way things are when they've been used hard for a long time. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my ex-husband's firm passed him over for the partnership he'd been expecting. I didn't feel particularly satisfied by that. He'd built his professional life on proximity to important people, and when the important people stopped returning calls, the scaffolding weakened. That's its own kind of lesson, and it wasn't mine to teach. I met someone at a food industry conference in Chicago 8 months after the divorce. His name is Kieran. He writes about the restaurant industry, long-form pieces for a national food magazine, the kind that follow a chef through a full season, rather than just reviewing the tasting menu. When someone mentioned my James Beard nomination at the pre-dinner reception, he turned to me with genuine curiosity and asked about the methodology behind scaling a menu concept across multiple kitchen teams without losing integrity. Not wow, that's impressive, an actual question about the actual work. We talked through most of dinner. He visited the test kitchen a few weeks later, not as a profile subject, just because he asked and I said yes, and spent 2 hours tasting things, asking real questions, wanting to understand the decisions rather than just admire the results. He told me once, a couple months in, that the thing he found most interesting about my work was that it was invisible to the people it served. A hotel guest reaches for a second ramekin of honey miso butter and feels something warm without knowing why. They don't know there's a person who spent 3 weeks testing ratios to arrive at exactly that feeling. You engineer the experience without being in it, he said. That takes a specific kind of confidence. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said to me about my work. I ran into my ex-husband once after everything was finalized. A Sunday morning at the farmer's market near our old neighborhood. I was there for honey from a local apiary I'd started using in testing. He was at a produce stand and looked like he'd lost weight he hadn't meant to lose. We saw each other at the same moment. We said each other's names. He asked how I was. I said genuinely good, and meant it without any effort. He mentioned hearing about the James Beard nomination and said congratulations. I said thank you, and it didn't cost me anything at all. He stood there for a moment like he was deciding something. I'm sorry, he said finally, for all of it. The way I treated you during the marriage. The legal stuff. After. All of it. He looked tired rather than rehearsed, which was the first time an apology from him had come from somewhere that felt real. You deserved better than what I gave you. I thought about the 3 weeks he spent preparing me to be his accessory. I thought about Douglas walking past him in the lobby. I thought about sitting in Opal's guest room that first night, a glass of wine on the nightstand, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, but something that had been slightly misaligned for years finally settling into place. I hope things get better for you, I said. And I meant it. Not generously, but indifferently, the way you mean something when it no longer has any hold on you. I walked back to my car and drove to the test kitchen and called Kieran, who asked how the honey from the new apiary tasted and whether I thought it would work for the croissant project I'd been developing, and we talked for an hour about nothing that wasn't exactly what it appeared to be. That's the thing about being with someone who actually knows what you do. Every conversation is just a conversation. You don't have to translate yourself, you don't have to manage what they know about you, or decide which parts of your work are safe to bring up or brace for the glazed look that crosses someone's face when you get too specific about something you love. You just get to be what you are. I spent 3 years treating that like a small thing, letting someone else's discomfort with my work determine how much space I took up in my own life. I was too careful, too willing to call his condescension consideration, too quick to assume that the version of me he'd decided on must be closer to the truth than my own understanding of myself. I know better now. I drive to the test kitchen every morning in my Subaru, with the tasting spoons in the cup holder, and I build things that matter to people who will never know my name. The hotel guests who ask for a second helping. The conference attendees who actually look forward to lunch for once. The road-weary traveler who eats something somewhere above the clouds and thinks, just for a moment, that someone out there cared enough to make it right. That's the work. That's what it was always worth. And the only thing I regret is how long I spent letting someone convince me it wasn't.